Minnesota Governor Tim Walz has announced the launch of a civil rights probe into the Minneapolis Police Department. 4 police officers in the city were involved in the killing of George Floyd last week. The state's Human Rights Department has filed a civil rights charge against the Municipal Police Department and will investigate its policies, procedures, and practices over the past 10 years to determine if they engage in systemic discriminatory practices. 46-year-old Floyd died after ex-cop Derek Chauvin knelt on his neck for nearly 9 minutes during an arrest on May the 25th. Chauvin has been arrested on third-degree murder and second-degree manslaughter charges. 3 other officers involved in the arrest have not been charged. Protests over the death of African-American George Floyd in police custody have shown no signs of easing, even after President Donald Trump threatened to deploy federal troops against demonstrators. Trump said on Monday that he will send American soldiers to the streets to quell the worst unrest since the 1960s, unless cities and states take stronger action against protests. Meanwhile, there have been reports that U.S. troops and military assets are guarding the White House. For more about the current situation in the U.S. Capitol, we spoke to our correspondent Jagrudi Dave. Could you first share more information with us about the latest situation in Washington?
Well, it's the second day of another curfew that starts in just over an hour and a half. We are already seeing protests gathering. They start peacefully as they had done yesterday, but of course this is the night after clashes between police and protesters, most notably the dispersing of protesters outside the White House in Lafayette Square, just as the president was delivering a statement where he called himself an ally of peaceful protesters. We've since found out that Attorney General William Barr, according to reports, ordered the protesters to be dispersed yesterday. A Justice Department official is being reported to have said that. William Barr said in a statement that even greater law enforcement resources are to be used in Washington, D.C. On Tuesday evening tonight.
Mm-hmm. We know the National Guard has been sent to reinforce local police to restore order. Why has it been deemed necessary to mobilize the military at this moment?
Well, the president, one of the things he said in that statement yesterday is the president told governors that they should deploy the National Guard in order to quell the protests, and if they refused to, then the president threatened to mobilize the military to do it for them. This is part of his strategy to portray himself as the president of law and order. And there have been protests spreading across several cities across the United States, and many of them have become violent, with clashes between police and protesters, and there's been looting reported in cities like New York, and this is one of the reasons why the president is speaking about a tough crackdown on protests. But there are many critics who say that what he's ordering is a crackdown on peaceful protests, on protesters who are trying to raise the issue of racial injustice in the United States. I mean, some of the tactics that were used yesterday, there was footage of a military helicopter that was used to disperse protesters in Washington, D.C. They were using the propellers to cause wind and debris to try to disperse the crowds underneath. I mean, extraordinary scenes that we are seeing on the streets of Washington.
That's our correspondent Jagrudi Dave on the current situation in Washington. Any move by President Donald Trump to put troops on the streets will require him to invoke the 1807 Insurrection Act that allows the president to deploy the military on U.S. soil. The act is an exception to the country's general rule that bans presidents from using the military as a domestic police force. It was last invoked in 1992 amid the riots after the acquittal of police officers who had beaten African-American man Rodney King in Los Angeles. U.S. President Donald Trump and his wife have visited the St. John Paul II National Shrine in Washington, where they laid a ceremonial wreath to mark the 100th anniversary of the birth of the former pope. The president and First Lady made a trip a day after Trump's highly controversial visit to the historic St. John's Episcopal Church, where he posed with a Bible out front after clearing protesters from the area. The stop was criticized by a number of clerics and religious leaders. Washington, D.C. Mayor Muriel Bowser says she will push back on President Donald Trump's idea of having armed military deployed on the streets amid days of protests.
Absolutely. We don't want the armed National Guard, armed military, and we don't want any of those things on D.C. streets.
The mayor was speaking one day after riot police moved on protesters outside the White House with tear gas. Bowser has voiced her support for the protests, but also announced a 7 p.m. curfew to head off the looting and property destruction in the U.S. Capitol. New York Mayor Bill de Blasio says it would be a huge mistake to deploy the National Guard to quell the protests in the city. De Blasio says the city's 36,000 police officers are well equipped to deal with the situation.
But you bring outside armed forces into an equation that they are not trained for, people who could be very, very unnerved by the dynamics that our police officers have learned to work with and deal with. That is a dangerous scenario. So I want to just put down the marker. The National Guard should not be brought here.
New York City police officers responded to numerous reports of looting in Manhattan and other borough streets when the 11 p.m. curfew fell on Monday. Police Commissioner Dermot Shead says police made 700 arrests. De Blasio and Shead urged community leaders to denounce violence in their neighborhoods. The New York mayor also extended the city's curfew to begin at 8 p.m. Prime Minister Justin Trudeau says Canadians are watching with horror what's happening in the United States. He was responding to questions about President Donald Trump's handling of the unrest in the United States and his threat to use the army to quell the protests.
We all watch in horror and consternation what's going on in the United States. It is a time to pull people together, but it is a time to listen. It is a time to learn what injustices continue despite progress over years and decades.
Trudeau also called on Canadians to use this moment to confront their own problem of racism. He says Canadians need to be allies in the fight against discrimination and work hard to come up with solutions. A top European Union diplomat says the EU is shocked and appalled by the killing of George Floyd in police custody.
We are shocked and appalled by the death of George Floyd, and I think that all societies must remain vigilant against the excess of use of force and ensure that all such incidents are addressed safely, effectively, and in full respect for the rule of law and human rights.
The EU's foreign policy chief Josep Borrell says Floyd's death shows an abuse of power by law enforcement. Borrell adds that any abuse of power by law enforcement must be denounced everywhere. He says they condemn violence and racism and calls for de-escalation of tensions. Iranian Judiciary Chief Ebrahim Raisi is accusing the United States of systemic racism, suggesting it should be tried by the international community for human rights violation.
Racism has become systemic in America. This is not merely an action of the police, but it's the domineering attitude that exists in every corner of their hegemonic system.
Raisi is the latest high-ranking Iranian official to criticize the United States over the death of George Floyd. Former President Mohammad Ahmadinejad has called the police killing disturbing and upsetting, while former Foreign Minister Mohammad Javad Zarif offered a rewritten statement based on one earlier issued by U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, cursing out Iran and replacing it with America. Floyd's death was the latest case of police brutality against black men that prompted an outcry over racism in U.S. law enforcement. For more about racial tensions in the U.S., Huang Yue spoke to Zhao Hai, research fellow at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences.
Why does racism remain a prominent social issue in the United States?
This is a long-term problem in American history. As you said, not only these happen in recent years and it's growing more and more severe, but historically, looking back in the 1960s, right after and during the civil rights movement, and in the early 1992, as we can recall, from the LA riots, there has been a long history of rioting and continued crackdown from the U.S. government. These problems emerge from time to time means that fundamentally the U.S. system remains repressive and discriminatory against black people in America, and this problem has not been solved fundamentally. And recently, there are growing factors in American politics dividing the society, making this problem even more complicated and difficult to resolve. One of the reasons is because in the past 20 years, the gap between the rich and poor growing more rapidly, and American system, particularly political systems, do not take care of the redistribution of wealth, making the young people and the poor people has less and less hope. And in this desperate time, complicated by COVID-19, the recent pandemic, their livelihood is even more difficult, and that makes them very much, fuel for the fire. Once this fire is lit by this very incident of George Floyd, this fire has become bigger and bigger throughout the American society, as we can see today that most of American states now have not only protests, but more and more cities have more violent riots. So I think today, these problems, because they're interconnected, the historical legacy of colonialism, of the history of slavery, and the institutionalization of this racism, coupled with today's new emerging problems, as well as the fast transmission of communication among people, particularly young people, using internet apps, using social media, making this problem very widespread and very quickly, and also the government less likely to have a quick response and proper response to this wide range of social unrest.
That was Zhao Hai at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences commenting on the root cause of the ongoing violent protests across the United States. You're listening to the Beijing Hour. Coming up, the Chinese city worst hit by the coronavirus has completed COVID-19 tests on close to 10 million local residents in just under 3 weeks to screen asymptomatic patients.
The Beijing Hour. The Beijing Hour. The Beijing Hour brings you an hour of comprehensive news and information from both China and the rest of the world. A mix of news, sports, and entertainment. In-depth analysis of the day's big stories, as well as the most comprehensive business of the day. The Beijing Hour. Beijing Hour. Your very own window to China and the rest of the world.
It's 15 minutes past the hour. Chinese President Xi Jinping has called for efforts to build a strong public health system to improve pandemic monitoring and warning systems and to improve pandemic prevention and treatment capabilities. The president made the remarks during a meeting with officials, scholars, and scientists in Beijing. President Xi also says the country must remain vigilant in addressing and preventing pandemics and other public health crises after the coronavirus outbreak. The Chinese city worst hit by the coronavirus has completed COVID-19 tests on close to 10 million local residents, or 90% of the population, in just under 3 weeks to screen asymptomatic patients. Guo Yan has details.
In a citywide campaign, Wuhan tested over 9.89 million people between May the 14th to June the 1st. No confirmed cases were reported. However, 300 asymptomatic cases were detected. Over 1,000 people in close contact with those carriers were tested and confirmed negative. Top infectious disease expert Li Lanjuan, who's also a senior medical advisor for the National Health Commission, says the testing results prove that the city is now safe.
The mass testing hasn't found any cases that were related with the 300 asymptomatic infections, which suggests that the infectivity is quite small. 97% of the residents who were tested were found negative.
On May the 14th, the city launched a campaign to conduct a nucleic acid test to those not tested before. Officials said the move was aimed at reassuring the public as the city reopens its factories, businesses, and schools. On June the 1st, the local CDC also collected over 2,300 samples of tap water in various public places, including bus stations, subways, shopping malls, and restaurants. All the samples returned tested negative for the virus. Deputy Director Wang Weihua of the Wuhan Health Commission says the campaign involves massive mobilization of local residents calling for public support through various social media platforms. She adds that they also pulled medical resources from other parts of the nation and tried new test methods to increase efficiency. Apart from the existing 23 test institutions, we mobilized 40 medical institutions to take part in the campaign, which hugely improved our capacity for testing. We also mobilized medical workers and resources from across the country. Medical staff working at the third-party test institutions rose from 419 to 1,451. We applied new methods and techniques which helped us improve efficiency. We're now able to test 1 million per day, a big leap from 300,000 per day before. The citywide testing campaign cost 900 million yuan or $126 million and was financed by the local government. For the Beijing Hour, this is Guo Yan.
Many cities across China have eased the restrictions on street vending as a way to revive the country's economy. Fu Yu has more.
Rules on street vending in many places across China used to be harsh on vendors who occupy outdoor spaces or other public areas. The once prohibited activities are gradually coming back under improved management and planning in some cities. Chengdu in Sichuan province is one of the first cities in the country to relax its restrictions. Stalls are now allowed to take up public space at designated locations, provided they follow sanitation regulations and don't block emergency exits. The policies have helped 100,000 people find jobs in the city. The stalls are also giving customers more dining choices when searching for places to eat.